You won't believe what I did after my granddaughter called my gift cheap. She said it like she was explaining a stain on a dress. Amber held the doll by the neck as if its knitted body might ooze embarrassment onto her palm. And the room, my living room, the one with the faded family photos along the mantel and the sea glass bowl James used to collect, filled with a warm, brittle laughter that felt like ice. It was the sound that settles into your ribs and refuses to leave. I had spent the better part of 3 months on those dolls. My hands, stiff with the early complaints of old arthritis, had fought their way through fine yarn and tiny buttons. I had tested colors beneath the lamp on the porch swing, humming the tune James whistled when he came home from the docks. The bigger doll I had tucked a secret into, a tiny flat setting sewn into the back of its neck under a swatch of crocheted velour where no one would think to look. The little diamond had belonged to James's mother. He had once called it the stubborn little thing. It had survived being melted down once during wartime rationing and 3 moves across the country. It had watched our children grow, sat in boxes during summers, and become mine when James and I decided diamonds were sentimental, not necessary. I wrapped it up inside that doll because there were things you keep, not because they'll buy you dinner, but because they remember you. Amber didn't ask why I had made it. She didn't ask about James. She didn't notice the way the tiny setting caught the lamplight and threw back a glint that made me think of the sea. She looked, she smirked, and with a flick of her eyes toward the new glossy invitations on the coffee table, ivory, gold embossed, she said, "This looks so cheap." The sound of the room's laughter is the thing you remember when you try to tell the moment. It wasn't all of them laughing. Some faces were polite, some shocked, but enough laughed that the curve of my mouth froze. I felt the air change around me, my son Richard's hand on the back of a chair, Vanessa's laugh too loud, Amber as if on a stage. Thomas, bless him, looked like someone had asked him to choose sides mid-breath. I placed the second doll on the coffee table and pulled the other closer to my chest. My fingers remembered the stitches even if my eyes were blurred. Someone called my name, maybe Judith or a cousin who'd come down from Boston, but my answer came from a place farther back than embarrassment. It was a slow, hot click, recognition that this was not only a single cruel remark, it was a measurement. It told me what I had been to them for a long time. They left with plates of cake and wrapped presents and the hum of wedding talk, the venue, the caterer, the photographer, as easily as breath. They smelled like perfume and expensive cologne, like other people who believe that lineage is line item. I picked up the dolls, feeling the weight of the little secret and the weight of everything else that fits into a body as you get older. Pills in jars, a memory of beaches that are warmer in the mind than in reality, the slow ache of joints that used to be ignored. That night, I sat on the porch swing until the moon riced the harbor and the house settled the way it always had when James slept. I thought of where that diamond had been before I wrapped it away. I thought of the year James planted the hydrangeas and how we sat on this very swing, planning nothing more complicated than which shade of white to paint the guest room. The memory was a small, steady lantern. Amber's voice had been a gust. The next morning, the email changed everything. It was innocuous at first, a forwarded engagement announcement from Amber, a photo of the two of them kissing under string lights, a caption about new beginnings. I felt my smile become something mechanical and put it aside. Then I noticed the attachments. The invitations were there, yes. There was even a floor plan of a small renovated beach house that I somehow didn't recognize when I first glanced. I set my glasses down on the table, one arm crooked, and read the annotation in Vanessa's neat font. "We'll need to update Eleanor's will to reflect sale proceeds. Keep in touch with me for dates." I must have let out a sound because Thomas looked up from the kitchen where he was making coffee. He came and sat beside me and peered at the screen. "They're planning renovations?" he asked. They, I said, and the word felt cold and impersonal as wet sea glass. It would be dishonest to present myself as surprised by family interest. For years, Richard had spoken of the beach house as a thing to be tidy and managed. He called it the asset once, that single time when James's inventory of tools and boats and letters felt like port in a storm of practical comments. But there is a difference between an adult son admiring the shingles and a party of people discussing an asset as if it can be separated from the place where you learn to dance in socks with your husband. An asset has no porches. An asset doesn't know the syllable of your laugh. The brochure for a renovation firm lay on my kitchen table as though it had always been my mail. There were photos of open-plan living spaces, of pale oak and industrial fixtures, of the very view from my bedroom window. Only the photos made the sea look like a backdrop for a party. I flipped through it as though I were holding someone else's life. On the inside flap, I found a penciled note. "Let's get this done before summer. Amber." I pressed my thumb into the paper until it left an indentation. A week of small intrusions followed. I found, propped by the telephone, a glossy business card for a retirement community open house downtown, with a penciled circled date. Someone, Vanessa likely, with that tiny neat script, had left it in plain view, as if to suggest I make a plan. The brochure for a renovation firm lay on my kitchen table, as though it had always been my mail. There were photos of open-plan living spaces, of pale oak and industrial fixtures, of the very view from my bedroom window. Only the photos made the sea look like a backdrop for a party. I flipped through it as though I were holding someone else's life. On the inside flap, I found a penciled note. "Let's get this done before summer. Amber." A week of small intrusions followed. I found, propped by the telephone, a glossy business card for a retirement community open house downtown, with a penciled circled date. Someone, Vanessa likely, with that tiny neat script, had left it in plain view, as if to suggest I make a plan. The email changed everything. A photograph of James, the one where he was 27 and taller than the lobster boat that sits at the harbor's edge, had been moved from the mantel to a less conspicuous frame in the hall. I took it down and put it back the way it had always been, and under my breath told James that I would not let the pictures be shuffled without my say. And then one evening, when I went to check my email for the 100th time, a nervous habit I'd picked up in these decades when bills came with more promises than guarantees, there was a notice that a financial institution had sent, "Suspicious login attempt." It was worded politely, as if to avoid implying malice. It flagged a login from an unrecognized device. There was a timestamp. I stared at it the way you stare at a small hole in a wall. You know someone has behind it, but you cannot see the hands. I called the number on the alert, feeling momentarily foolish, and then ashamed that the idea of someone riffling through accounts had to be explained by numbers and office hours. The woman who answered said not to worry, that they were flagging attempts all the time. Her voice had the flat corporate kindness that both soothes and absolves. Thomas came in from the porch with more coffee, sat down, and watched my face. "We should look at the statements," he said quietly. We sat at the kitchen table, me with my knitting needles, him with spreadsheets that made him squint, and he pulled up the online account. There were, indeed, transfers that could have been explained away as household expenses, but a few lines were unfamiliar. Vendor names I didn't recognize, amounts that had the look of earnestness rather than oversight. Thomas's jaw was tight. He is the sort of man who will not let a detail slide into a crease of forgetfulness. "It could be a mistake," he said, because he could not make the leap I was beginning to imagine. He is younger and wants the world patched, not pried open. "Call Mom," he suggested, and his kindness made me feel like a child again. I called Judith before I called anyone else. My friend from high school, her laugh is still quick and honest, and her hands smell faintly of lemon when she hugs you. She has been with me through funerals and births, and once, the storm when the roof needed to be repaired and the insurance man took his sweet time. Judith came over, and we sat at the table while the afternoon light leaned through the blinds. I told her, and I cried a little in that kitchen full of light, not dramatic sobs, but the kind that fog up your vision and make the future look like a watercolor. "It's not your imagination," she said. She had a way of trimming the edges of panic with practical language. When someone begins to move things around, it's a pattern. Keep the shirts in the closet where you always do. Keep the photographs where they belong. Don't be rushed. Judith always says don't be rushed like it is a spell. Perhaps it is. Her presence steadied me enough to begin the work of noticing rather than reacting. We made a list on a napkin, missing photos, unfamiliar invoices, odd logins, and the invitations with that penciled note. We circled certain dates. We agreed I would call Marcus Cooper, the estate attorney who had once helped James with tax questions and who had a reputation for being steady the way a lighthouse is steady, unflashy, reliable. I expected there to be a conversation full of legalese, but Marcus is a man who speaks in clear sentences. When I asked about options, he answered in the language of care. "You have the right to decide what to do with your property," he said. "You can arrange for privacy in the sale. You can secure accounts. But anything beyond that, you should consider with a professional who knows your exact situation." He did not offer me a map. He offered me a thermometer. What you need is protection and dignity. Dignity. The word landed like something warm in my hand. I thought of how Amber had tossed the doll like a thing to be judged for price, and how Richard had called the beach house an asset as though it were a ledger. I thought of James teaching me to recognize gulls at dusk, the way he could tell a storm was coming by the smell of low tide. I began to see the options not as maneuvers to punish, but as a way to keep my memories breathing without them being parceled for someone else's success. Marcus suggested a few careful steps: an audit of accounts, secure passwords, language he used as if we sat in his office with steaming coffee rather than over my chipped mug, and, quietly, the possibility of a discreet sale. "Discretion," he said, tapping his pen on the edge of his legal pad. "If you are concerned about undue influence, a private sale can reduce the noise." He emphasized discretion as if it were a blanket I might wrap around the things I wanted to keep. "Will they know?" I asked, picturing Amber's face when she pieced together the plan like a puzzle of polite outrage. "They will know," Marcus said plainly. "They may say you were hasty. They may say you were unwell. That is their right to say. You have the right to decide what comes next." When I came off the phone, I felt an odd combination of grief and relief. Grief for the loss of the imagined family gathering that would someday include my beach house's background, and relief that the house's future might remain connected to me in a way that honored my memory instead of auctioning it off in the currency of entitlement. I folded the knitted dolls and put them in the cedar chest by the foot of my bed, between the old quilts and the letters James had written me on thin blue paper. The secret diamond was safely tucked inside the doll I had first given Amber, and I listened to the tiny presence of it like a heartbeat. The first time I used the phrase out loud, "I'm considering selling the beach house," I felt the room breathe in. Thomas's face was unreadable. Judith's mouth tightened, then softened. When I said, simply, "I want to choose where my memories live," the sentence was less a statement than a claim. It was a claim for autonomy that felt in the back of my throat, like asking to keep the right to decide where the curtains go. I did not make the decision in a moment of spite. There was sorrow threaded through the choice like the silver in the yarn. I thought of James's boat bobbing in the harbor, the back steps creaking under the weight of 100 summers. Selling the house would mean letting go of an anchor I had clung to through widowhood and small, beautiful rituals. It would mean permitting other hands to arrange the shelves that had once held my grandmother's pottery. But there is a difference between clinging to memory and allowing memory to be used as a bargaining chip. As the week moved, the undercurrent of family talk became louder. There were more invitations, more offhand remarks about timing and efficiency. Amber sent a photo of the dress she'd chosen, and I watched her face, joyful, impatient, and felt the tilt of two timelines. Hers, which was new and gleaming and aimed at tomorrow, mine, which folded around itself like a well-loved map. At one point, Vanessa came by under the pretense of returning my sugar bowl after the party. She said, "Eleanor, we're only trying to help." Her tone had that layered quality. Caring, yes, but edged with entitlement. I looked at her, hands manicured, ring on the left finger, and thought of the way she had once tucked my recipes into a binder and called them quirky. She was not cruel by nature. She was practical in a way that sometimes ignored the human corners. "It doesn't feel like help," I said. "It feels like a plan formed without me." Her face softened. "We're thinking about practical matters, Mom," she said. And there it was again. My son's, then hers, their shared belief that practical matters themselves are discrete from the lives they touch. I told her I would be speaking with Marcus about my options. She nodded the way someone nods when they accept a verdict but don't quite like the sentencing. "Make sure you don't rush these things," she said, words that had an odd echo of Judith's early counsel. The house, in the days following, felt like a place suspended between two states, lived in and prepped for exit. Mismatched glasses sat in the cupboard. James's old plaid robe still hung in the linen closet, though months had passed since I saw him wrap himself in it during winter. I began to catalog memories the way an archivist might, not because I intended to pin them down, but because the act of noticing seemed to make them less vulnerable. I took extra care with the photo album from our first summer here, smoothed the pages so no edge turned, and made a lemon pie, James's favorite, because fidelity to small rituals was itself an act of defiance. Then, one afternoon, while I was sorting a box of letters, Thomas came to the back porch and stood in the doorway holding an envelope. He had been quiet all morning, brief conversations with Banks, he later told me, that left him looking like a man who had watched waves crash at a rock and wondered who would be left standing. "We should talk," he said. He placed the envelope between us on the table with the sort of reverence you give to a map. Inside were copies of vendor invoices, correspondences with a contractor who had been to the house to assess potential improvements, and a draft letter to a title company. Thomas had gone through my physical mail. He had always been careful with my privacy, but when he opened the envelope, I did not feel invaded. I felt accompanied. "This was on the porch when I came by to check on you Wednesday," he said. "Vanessa said she left it so you'd see the scope. It's all in her handwriting." I didn't see it, I admitted. There was a small, uncomfortable flare in me. One learns, as you age, that things are sometimes moved in the house without notice, the way a neighbor might rearrange your garden because they think they are helping. You have to choose whether to let it go or make a stand for the order that is yours. Thomas and I made a plan. He would help me inventory the accounts and keep watch, and I would set the dates for when I would meet Marcus. I could feel other plans braiding around mine, Amber's wedding planning, the contractor schedules, but as long as I could call time on the conversations and say, "This is my decision," I felt a steadying. Before the meeting with Marcus, I found myself awake at 3 a.m., hands idle and mind racing through decades like a person rifling through a photo album at night. Memories unspooled. James teaching me to shell peas, the sound of his laughter when I mispronounced caper, the way he folded his newspaper and left the sports page for me. Age brings you the strange gift of perspective. Things you would have once fought over seem absurd now, and other small humiliations take on the hue of danger only when you let them accumulate. Marcus's office smelled like men's cologne and stationery. He greeted me with the firmness of someone who understood both law and loneliness. We sat across from each other at a sensible table, and he placed a notepad in front of him like a small island of attention. "You're not the first client to come to me feeling steamrolled," he said. "What matters is whether they are acting in your interest or their own. We will start by documenting what you've noticed. Documentation runs farther than your memory. I had Thomas with me to corroborate, and Judith had written down dates for me. Marcus counted these like someone counting stones for a bridge. If you are concerned about undue influence, he said, we can explore ways to protect what you want preserved. That could include a private sale if you decide that is the best way to ensure your wishes are honored. A private sale. The phrase sits in your mouth like a clean coin. It keeps the house out of the public sweepstakes of conversation and suspicion. It offers privacy, which in turn can keep memory intact. But the idea of selling the beach house felt, astonishingly, like cutting a cord. Am I being dramatic? I asked. The question was so small and so huge that I surprised even myself with its simplicity. You're being prudent, Marcus said. You are recognizing patterns and responding. There is no shame in securing your autonomy. He did not press me, nor did he flatter me. He was a man who understood the gravity of legal steps and the humanity that sits on the other side of paperwork. He suggested I take my time, that I consider a confidential appraisal, and speak to a realtor who handles private sales. He warned, gently, that family reactions could range from relief to anger, and that anger often sounds like accusations when it is really fear. When I stepped out of his office and into the narrow street, the salt air struck me like clarity. The decision was not yet made. The idea of selling hovered like a gull over a tide pool, waiting to dip. I felt oddly, not vindictive, but purposeful. A motion stirred in the solar of my chest, one that carried grief and the possibility of restoration. That evening I made tea and sat with the cedar chest open at my feet. I pulled out the dolls and held them, letting the yarn slide across my palms. The diamond nestled against the swell of the knitted back like an old secret humming with its own light. I thought of the smallness of it, the stone, the stitch, and of how quickly it had revealed a larger truth, that appearances can mislead, and that sometimes the heart of a thing is hidden from those who would judge by surface. This is where I left the decision to sit with me for a few days. I walked the house as one might walk a room in slow motion, noticing the way light slanted and how the porch creak had become a metronome of comfort. I measured not rooms with tape, but memory with sensation. The scuffed stair where James once tripped while carrying a tray of early morning coffee, the smell of lemon oil in the hallway where we'd sanded the banister together. Each memory was a thread in a tapestry I had not intended to offer up for auction. But in the nights, I woke thinking of Amber's smirk, of the invitations, of the odd logins flagged by the bank. I felt a tension like a taut string. There is a part of growing older that is about choosing your soft edges. You choose which things to let go of, and you choose which things to guard. I had been taught in marriage and motherhood that to keep peace sometimes meant to be quiet. But peace, I was learning, had a cost when it was bought at the expense of your dignity. I told myself that I was not closing a door as much as I was choosing where my next chapter would be lived. There is an enormous difference between being carried along by events and steering a small, determined course. I wanted the latter. The next morning, Thomas came early. He carried a thermos of coffee and a folder. We sat on the porch while the day yawned awake. If you go forward with this, he said, I'll stand with you, whatever it is. His voice was steady, and I believed him. We began gently to plan the first moves, not the technicalities. Marcus would guide those, but the personal things I needed to do first. Inventory photographs, box up sentimental items that were non-negotiable, write a letter to myself reminding who I was beyond their laughter. It felt oddly liberating to do practical things while holding a grief like a small, manageable animal in my lap. I wasn't trying to erase the past. I was trying to make sure it lived in the right hands. On the kitchen counter, the two knitted dolls waited in the cedar chest like quiet witnesses. I looked at them and thought of Amber. I thought of the arc of a gesture and the weight of a word. That afternoon, I wrapped one in tissue paper and tucked the small, secret diamond into my pocket. I wanted to keep it close, not as a piece of bling, but as a talisman of the life James and I had built, stubborn, weathered, and somehow luminous. When Vanessa called that evening and asked cheerfully about plans for the weekend, I told her I had a few appointments to make. Her voice shifted to a tone of misplaced concern. "Are you sure you don't want to wait?" she said. "We can all sit and talk about this together." I thought of the invitations, the penciled notes, the bank alert that had arrived, politely accusing the night. "We will talk," I said, "but I'll do it on my terms." She paused, and in the pause I could hear the recalculation. "Okay," she said finally, too large a word for the temperature between us. "Okay." I had no illusions about storms ahead. People do not always forgive what they view as loss of advantage, and family can be both the safest place and the most bewildering theater for that anger. But I also had no illusions that inaction would protect my heart. I am old enough to know that time does not guarantee fairness. It only offers the chance to act with reason. So I set myself to the work of remembering and reclaiming. I wrote lists and made calls that felt like setting boundaries rather than building walls. I gave Thomas the go-ahead to speak with the bank if he needed to. I asked Judith to be my witness if anyone tried to press me into agreement with a plan that did not feel right. I did not and will not take this lightly. This is not a drama of revenge. This is an act of preservation, an attempt to keep my story intact instead of having it rewritten in someone else's careful hand. There is a peculiar intimacy in taking responsibility for your life when others expect you to cede it. It feels like being admonished by your own heart to stand up, even if your knees are weary. I stood because, in the end, dignity requires action as much as memory does. And yet, as I folded the last of the evening linens and slid the cedar chest closed, a small tremor of fear settled in the place where the stomach knits itself to the spine. I knew the sale, if it came to pass, would set off a constellation of responses: anger, hurt, accusations that I had been manipulated by a younger generation, whispers that perhaps I was not myself. I knew that the decision to sell might be read as a dagger, when in fact it was meant as a shield. The next step, meeting the realtor who handled private sales, was scheduled for Thursday. I slept with the dolls on my bedside table, thinking of the ways small things can hide bigger truths. I thought of Amber and the way youth can mistake impatience for insight. I thought of James, who would have frowned at my worrying and told me to make tea. I thought of my hands, knotted and skilled, and how they had made the dolls to keep a small piece of the past safe. Thursday was a day bright with wind. The harbor seemed to have polished itself overnight. I poured tea and tried to practice the sentence I'd rehearsed in front of the mirror. "I want to control the future of the house." It sounded steelier out loud than I expected. I folded the phrase into my chest and went to the porch swing to wait for the knock that promised the beginning of a new chapter, one I intended to write. Some choices are quiet before they bloom into consequences. I could not know, then, as I sat with my hands knitting and my eyes on the horizon, who would stand with me and who would turn. But I knew this much. After that birthday party, after the curt dismissal of a doll as cheap, nothing could be the same. The laughter had measured more than a haircut or a dress. It had marked a line in the sand. I had, gently but firmly, decided to step over it and see what came next. The knock came like a promise. 3 measured raps, not loud enough to startle, but certain enough that the house answered. I smoothed the front of my cardigan with fingers that still remembered the mechanics of patience and opened the door to find Jennifer Maxwell, realtor, hair in a neat bun, an elbowed portfolio under her arm like a shield. She smiled in that professional, disarming way realtors have. She knew houses and how to talk about them softly, like someone handling a piece of china. Jennifer had been recommended by Marcus. Works quietly, he'd said, and she carried the sort of discretion you hope for when the thing at stake is more than square footage. She had brought a sample brochure, an appraisal estimate, and an envelope with a list of potential buyers who preferred privacy above parade. "You've done a wonderful job with the place," she said at the threshold, eyes sweeping the familiar, the brass bell on the wall that James had insisted upon, the faded rug by the door, the photo of us at the wharf holding a catch so much larger than sense. Her assessment felt warm, like tea poured into a cup set on a doily. We sat in the kitchen, where the sunlight came in like good news. She talked in a voice that respected my rhythm. No rush, no puffed-up claims. "Private sale means targeting a buyer who values the home as it is," she explained. "Often a retired couple, sometimes someone who's been looking for a house with history, not just an updated kitchen. We can arrange viewings by appointment only. Discretion is the key. We market quietly, communicate directly, and keep the circle small." Her words were careful, like someone naming a condition instead of a crime. She didn't promise miracles. She didn't say the family would understand or that pain wouldn't follow. She only outlined how to move the house out of public conversation and into a place where the future could be decided with fewer ears listening. That was enough. Some mornings I still wake with the feeling of that day, the odd, honest decisions simmering into motion. The first practical step was simple and private, an appraisal that recognized what the house was now, not what a renovation show might want it to be. Jennifer brought in an appraiser who walked with his hands in his pockets and nodded when I pointed out the small things. The scuffed floorboard where James once stubbed his toe, the little chip on the hearth we'd never gotten around to mending. He listened like someone reading a map of a life. "You can make it more valuable by ripping things out," he said, matter of fact. "Or you can sell it as a place with history. Buyers pay for both, but they're different markets." Jennifer found the buyer quickly and quietly. They were a couple from inland, retired teachers who had once spent summers on the Cape and wanted to come back to the coast for their grandchildren. They sent a letter with their offer, written in a hand that suggested they valued the house for its porches and the slow light through the kitchen tiles. There was a line in the letter that stopped me in my tracks. "We want to keep the stars in the sky you've always enjoyed." It was a small sentence, written by someone who imagined the house as a human habitation rather than a ledger. We agreed to a private showing in late spring, no open house, no parade of strangers. Jennifer handled negotiations with an economy of words that felt like an ally lowering a curtain to spare me what needn't be theater. The buyer wanted to keep the original siding, to restore the clapboards, and, this made me smile, to leave the garden bed by the breakfast nook. They asked about the hydrangeas James planted. I told them where every plant came from and why the back porch had a spot where the paint was always a shade too thin. They listened, and I felt something unmonetized in the room, a respect that does not always come with an offer. Word moves in families like smoke. Even the quietest things have a way of warming a room until it flares. Before we closed, rumors threaded into paper-thin accusations. Vanessa's messages grew sharper, more insistent. Richard's tone became brittle. Amber texted once, then twice, then not again. The silence between her texts felt noisier than anything she could have said. They called a meeting, what they called a family council, and invited my friends. It was to be held at the country club, of all places, where laughter goes well with the clink of glass and people practice their concern among buffet stations. I thought about not going. Part of me wanted to avoid the theater of accusation. Another part of me wanted to show up, to show the face that had been laughed at, and prove there was no shame in choosing my next steps. I went. They had arranged the table as if for arbitration, menus laid like placards, the overhead lights a little too bright. Vanessa arrived with a smile that looked like a carefully polished platter. Richard wore the same sweater he'd had on the night we argued about the garage tools, practicalities wrapped in habit. Amber floated in like a sprite, her engagement ring flashing like the rest of their plans. Thomas slipped in quietly and sat by me as he always had, a neighborly shoulder against the tide. "You shouldn't do anything hasty, Mom," Vanessa said early, as if the word hasty were a balm. She folded her hands in that particular way she has, like an accountant closing a ledger. "I'm not being hasty," I said. "I am being deliberate." They put papers on the table, forms with legalese, blue pens, the kind of documents you slide across when you mean to make something final. "Why not a trust?" Richard asked, his voice leaning on the idea that there are always neutral legal forms to smooth the edges of disagreement. Vanessa explained with certainty how selling might complicate estate planning and how taxes might be impacted. They spoke as if I were an account to be balanced, rather than the person who loved a porch swing with a complaint in it. Amber, I remember, looked at the dolls when the conversation lilted toward the party. She touched one with the same slight curiosity she had shown the night she called my gift cheap. There was an awkward quiet, as if the dinner had been momentarily punctured by memory. And then she laughed softly, almost to herself. "You can't do this," she said at last, and it was said like an accusation flung rather than a plea. "I'm already doing it," I said. There wasn't an argument so much as the tearing of a paper one has been trying to fold into a square for too long. Vanessa called my judgment into question. Richard accused me of being manipulated. Amber's voice climbed into shrillness. "How could you not talk to us?" And somewhere between the tirade and the silence, someone mentioned health, someone mentioned pressure, and then someone else mentioned the word unwise. Thomas stood up, and I expected him to speak gently, to try to broker a détente the way he has ached to do his whole life. Instead, he said something else as quietly profound. "She's told us her reasons. She's discussed this with an attorney. She's not being coerced." The room tilted then, not suddenly, but like a small boat righting itself after a push. Some people, like Vanessa, were already gathered in their own certainty. Some, like Judith, who had come quietly in sensible shoes, kept their faces unreadable. People left in different stages of temper, mouths set, hands clenching napkins. Amber said the wedding could not go on with this hanging over us. She left the table abruptly, phone clutched, and she did not return. In the days after the meeting, I watched the small aftershocks. Messages arrived, thin, surgical. Congratulations couched in conditional language. Invites were rescinded. Thomas told me Amber had called Logan and broken things off, an emotional decision, he said, reached in the wake of family chaos and the uncomfortable realization that something she had looked forward to had been taken hostage by a house she didn't yet inherit. I don't judge her for choosing distance. The bride-to-be who had once danced in our kitchen could not be asked to host a wedding that would be a battlefield. I did not sleep much those nights. I am old enough to know that loss has many faces. I grieved not only the idea that my daughter's planned celebration was unmoored, but also the loss of a family script I had held. That of seamless passing, of hands arranging themselves in dutiful lines. I had expected disagreement perhaps, or negotiation, but not the raw, immediate fracture, the way a single word can crack an old bone. The sale closed in late June in a small office that smelled faintly of lemon oil. Marcus arranged everything so that the exchange felt like a private ritual rather than a spectacle. The buyers shook my hand with an earnestness that felt like a benediction. They promised in plain sentences to keep James's fishing stool in the shed and to let the hydrangeas bloom where they always had. I sat on the back porch the day after the closing and watched them move in, measuring their hands across the door frames as if learning the contours of a new body. After the house was sold, the responses ranged like weather: thunder, then sun, then a drizzle of small, tentative messages. Vanessa did not speak to me for a week. Richard sent an email, formal, stiff, accusing me of acting impulsively. Amber unfriended me on social media for a while and then, weeks later, wrote a message full of fragments. "I need time. I'm sorry. I'm confused." All the phrases of someone learning to read the edges of their own choices. I woke one morning to a stack of letters on the kitchen table, not angry, but unmoored. The house felt like an empty theater. The echoes of plate clinks and laughter had not moved with the buyers. I felt an odd lightness and a deep, honest grief. I packed with care. I cataloged every photograph, wrapped them in tissue, and labeled them in the way people who treasure relics do: "Do not leave behind." I wrote little notes to myself on the inside of old recipe cards where James's cursive still faded like a watermark. Moving day arrived like a small funeral, ritualized, dignified. Thomas drove up with a truck, dusty and reliable. He carried boxes with the same careful tenderness he had always reserved for fragile things. Judith sang quietly as she wrapped china, a low hymn of practicality. We laughed at odd little things, like finding a receipt from a diner James loved where he had scribbled "clam chowder" and underlined it in almost familial respect. We left the house with the door closed behind us and the sea pressed like an old friend against its porch. As the buyers started to settle in, I breathed in a way that felt like permission. I had chosen the frame of my own ending there. Someone new would add their chapters. There was a small ache of unmoored memory, but also a relief I could not name when I first set my bags down in Cambridge. Cambridge is a city that wears its intelligence lightly. My new apartment is modest, sunlight and a window that opens onto a tree-lined street where students rush and old men walk their dogs. It is not the same as the house with the porch swing and the hydrangeas, but it has its own quiet. I put the cedar chest in the corner, and every morning I walk by it like someone saluting a veteran. I think of James the way people sometimes think of a song. You may never hear it the same again, but the melody lives inside. The first week here, I slept like someone who had not been permitted to rest. The exhaustion I carried softened into sleep. My hands loosened. I began to knit again. Small things, pot holders, a scarf. Things that took my fingers through the same motions without requiring the weight of secret compartments. Thomas came down some weekends, and we walked the Charles River, talking quietly about his plans. He had always had a sensible way of looking at the world, part engineer, part poet. I felt good about giving him a cushion, a modest support to take a class in carpentry, to apprentice, to buy a proper tool chest. It felt right to put some of the proceeds toward his steadiness. I did it because I trusted him, because he had trusted me in turn. Messages came in waves and trickles. Some were warm, others icy. Vanessa called after a fortnight with a voice that had been ground down in the wash. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," she said in the way people say sorry when they cannot offer the conversation that would make up for things. She admitted to being frightened by change and ashamed at the things she'd tacitly hoped the house might provide for them, security perhaps, or a cushion to prop up their plans. Her admission was clumsy and human. She did not ask for absolution, She asked, awkwardly, if there might be a way back to talk. I met with Richard alone for coffee in a park. He fumbled with his cup and apologized in a way that sounded rehearsed but increasingly sincere. He talked about how he had felt entitled, how quietly over the years a belief had grown that family property was something to be managed by the eldest or by the one who announced intentions loudest. He did not defend himself. He admitted small cruelties and said he had been wrong to speak of the house in terms of spreadsheet and value without ever asking what it meant to me. He said he wanted to rebuild, if I would permit it, but he understood that trust takes a long time to grow. Amber's path was slower, and that was fair. She began therapy in the autumn. It was Thomas who told me this casually, over mugs of coffee, like someone announcing that the laundry had been done. He said she had called to ask if I'd accept a cup of coffee some Saturday, that she wanted to come and talk. I did not know what to expect. When she arrived, years of impatience and glitter in a single silhouette, her hand trembled when she put the dolls on my table. They were in a box in my closet, she said. She stopped and took a breath, and then she sat and told me about the knot inside her that had tightened at the party. I thought they were small and silly, she said. I didn't know what they were when you gave them to me. I thought it meant nothing. I was wrong. She fetched one of the dolls from the box and unfolded the fabric with the sort of attention I'd used on my quilts. Her fingers found the tiny seam I had sewn loose, and, with something like reverence, she opened it. The diamond lay there, tucked into a small protective fold. Her mouth parted, and for a moment the years between us seemed to hinge on that single finding. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't think. I only saw its outward things, what it might be worth, and not the story you were carrying. I don't know if you can forgive me." I held her hands, warm, younger, and still a little unsteady. Forgiveness is not always a single act. Often it is a slow allowance. "You can start by knowing the truth," I said. "The doll was a way to keep something we loved safe. Not every story has to be public to be important." She cried then, not in a dramatized fashion, but in the honest, blameless way people do when they realize they have been thoughtless. She told me about the pressure she had felt, the wedding, the expectations, the sense that life was moving faster than she could inventory. She confessed, haltingly, that part of her had been jealous of the older things that had been handed down, that she had assumed her history would arrive unbidden one day, and that impatience had made her cruel. In time, Amber began to show up more without the language of performance. She started volunteering at a local community center, something she'd mentioned in an offhand way years before, and there, in the small acts of service and slow conversation, she learned to hold her life with less display and more substance. Therapy, she would tell me later over tea, helped her see the scabs she'd been carving into her own choices. She apologized to me more than once, not in the clumsy tone of the party, but with the quiet of someone starting to realign the compass. Vanessa and I had a visit one autumn afternoon. She came with damp eyes and a packet of things she'd found in the attic. James's old hat, a photograph I'd thought long lost, and a note written in his uneven hand. I'm sorry," she said. "I thought I was helping. We were drowning and we grabbed for anything that might make us feel safe. That doesn't absolve me, Eleanor. I wish I'd asked." I listened, and in her voice I heard a fear I recognized, the terror of dwindling resources, of a middle-class dream suddenly feeling precarious. I did not excuse her, but I forgave. Forgiveness, I've learned, is its own labor, one that must be exercised in stages. She returned some of the invoices she'd moved into my file cabinet and handed me an apology written on rose stationery. We spoke for hours about small things, recipes, the way to knot the perfect bow on a package, the name of a neighbor whose geraniums keep failing. It felt like the slow reweaving of a cloth that had been frayed. Richard, too, reached out differently over time. He set photographs, new frames of the family, taken in settings that did not involve money or property, and with them short notes. Thinking of you. We miss you at the holidays. He showed up with a cooler of food one weekend and helped Thomas and me set up shelves in my new apartment. It was not everything, but it was a start. He spoke once of volunteering at the local library, which felt like an odd but honest attempt to re-anchor himself in acts that were their own recompense. There were also times of anger that did not resolve neatly. Weddings were canceled in ways that did not feel like drama, but like real doors closing between people. Friends took sides. Some spoke their minds freely. Others drifted towards safer shores. I lost a few acquaintances who valued the narrative of inheritance more than the messy reality of people choosing to be private. That was a small price to pay. One afternoon, months after the sale, a package arrived at my Cambridge door. It was an ordinary box, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Inside were the 2 knitted dolls, carefully placed in tissue. Alongside them, in a small velvet pouch, was the diamond. There was a note with Amber's handwriting, the same hand that had once made penciled notes on a renovation flyer, which said simply, "I found them. I'm sorry. I hope you can wear this when you feel proud, not hurt." I held the little stone in my palm and felt the warmth of a life that had been meant to be private, made public, then reclaimed. Jewelry is never only jewelry. It is a story made small enough to wear. I decided, in a small ceremony by my kitchen window, to have the diamond set again, not in anything ostentatious, but in a small pendant on a simple chain. It was not to show off. It was to remind me that the stubborn little thing, the way we keep and are kept by our memories, could still be mine to hold. Amber came to the housewarming I threw, a small gathering with Judith and Thomas and a couple of neighbors who had become friends. Vanessa brought lemon tarts. Richard sent a bouquet. Marcus, in a tweed jacket that suggested an office less frequently now, appeared with a bottle of sparkling cider and a steady smile. Amber stood at the doorway, and the first time our eyes met, she looked like someone saying, "I'm here and I'm trying." She approached me with fingers that trembled the same way they had months before, and handed me a small box. Inside was the pendant, the diamond reset, simple, deliberate, its light honest. Her voice wobbled a little when she said, "I wanted you to have this back properly." I fastened the chain and felt the cool touch of metal against my throat. It was not a cure. It was not a ticket to forgetting. It was a band of metal and stone and a story of reckoning. I lifted my glass and offered a toast to small reconciliations, to the idea that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is choose your own life, even when the ones you love misunderstand. There were no grand pronouncements at that dinner, no musical swell of forgiveness that rewritten the past. Instead, there were small gestures. Richard offering to send copies of old photographs digitally, Vanessa bringing a basket of home-baked bread, Thomas talking about his new class and how he wanted to build a bench for the community garden. Amber stayed late and helped me wash dishes in a way that felt like penance and also like repair. We sat on the couch and told stories of James, and the house, my little Cambridge apartment, felt threaded back together by the light of ordinary talk. People sometimes ask me if I regret selling the beach house, as if the question itself could be a verdict. I do not regret taking the step that allowed me to choose how my memories are kept. I miss the creak of the porch at dusk and the way the ocean breathed its blue into every room. I miss the way summer storm lights made the paint look like a different color every hour. Those are proper sorrows. But there is a difference between sorrow and shame. One asks you to honor what was, the other eats at what you have left. My life now is quieter, the streets are busier but less intrusive. I take the bus on sunny days, and sometimes read by the river. I go to a knitting circle on Tuesdays where women trade recipes and stories that have little to do with property or plans. I have learned to answer calmly when acquaintances marvel at my bravery. It was not bravado. It was a choice made because I wanted the dignity of saying where my memories would live. Sometimes in the evening, Judith calls, and we sit with the phone on speaker and talk about the small things that keep us going. What tea we prefer, which neighbor has started a new dog, which pastry is just right. Thomas's apprenticeship is going well. He has built a bench for the community garden and is saving for his own small shop. He calls me from time to ask my opinion on the finish of a table or to tell me about a man he met at a job site who used to know James. These are the kind of details that build a life not in headlines, but in the slow accumulation of ordinary loyalty. Amber and I have mended slowly and honestly. She comes over now bearing the odd, perfect gifts of someone learning to value the unplanned things. An armful of peonies in June, a loaf of bread she baked herself, a recipe she thought I might like. She asks about James and listens when I tell stories, truly listens, and sometimes she laughs at the way he used to try to teach me about knots. We have found new ways to be family that are not predicated on the idea that someone should inherit the stage props of a life. We have found that love does not always appear as a neat line from one generation to the next. Sometimes it shows up in the messy, small ways of apology and attendance. There is still work to be done. Richard and I have long, sometimes awkward conversations. Vanessa and I have learned to talk about money in ways that do not devolve into accusation. Marcus comes by for tea sometimes, and we talk about ordinary things like the weather, which, after a while, feels like a relief. The dolls sit in my cedar chest now, and the diamond rests at my throat. When I look in the mirror, I see not the person who was laughed at, but the woman who decided she would not let her life be quantified by someone else's impatience. I am older, yes. I am also always learning new things. I learned lately that choosing a life on your own terms does not mean you must sever every rope. It simply means you tie the knots carefully yourself. If you are still with me and this resonates, if you've ever been underestimated or felt your possessions and stories reduced to numbers, tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe for more stories like this and share this one with someone who might need to hear that choosing dignity is not a sin, but a right. There is a small ceremony I perform on the anniversary of the sale. I make a lemon pie, James would have liked the irony, and I set 2 cups of tea and a place for any visitors who choose to come. Sometimes friends appear. Sometimes I sit alone and listen to the city. I lift the pendant to the light and watch the stubborn little diamond catch the sun. It doesn't fix the past. Nothing can do that. But it reminds me of a truth that came out of a terrible, fragile season. That dignity can be fought for in quiet ways, and that sometimes the greatest kindness you can do for yourself is to decide, with clarity, how your story will be told. The house that once held our summers stands now with new curtains and someone else's laughter in the rooms. I think of the children who will someday run across those floors, of the hydrangeas in the backyard, of the tide marking its endless return. My memories travel with me in cardboard boxes and in the way I say James's name when I tell stories. I do not clutch after them. I hold them gently. The people I love are imperfect and complicated, and so am I. We have all, in our small ways, been learning how to live with the consequences of desire, impatience, and fear. So if you ever find yourself holding a secret in a knitted doll, or watching your life being appraised by people who don't know the smell of your kitchen, remember that you are allowed to choose who tends your story. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed, to the greatest degree possible in a world of messy ties, to keep your dignity. And if you have a story like mine, please share it in the comments. I would love to hear how you navigated the moments when you had to decide what belonged to you and what you would let go. Subscribe for more. There are always more stories, and there are always more ways to learn how to be gentle with ourselves while being firm about what matters. Thank you for listening.